On behalf of the American Australian Association, we're delighted to bring to you this Australia-US Critical Minerals Partnership Zoom debate. At the outset, I'd like to thank those that have joined us as panelists and Jeffrey Wilson for moderating this particular session. AAA would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and the connections to the land, sea and community. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all traditional owners of the lands that each of us work and live on today in Australia. The American Australian Association was established in 1948 following the Second World War, principally to build on the alliance between Australia and the United States. And it has, over the decades since, engaged in relationship building between our two great nations. In early 2006, we established the United States Study Centre at Sydney University, a think tank and research unit to build on that relationship and exchange students and fellowship programs, which is a key feature of the American Australian Association, established in New York and, as I mentioned, then in Australia, 2006. Subsequent to the success of the Sydney Centre, we established the Perth USAsia Centre at the University of Western Australia to focus on the Indo-Pacific and its importance in the region that we now face. And as we move into decades since, the important work of both study centres is underscored by the importance and relevance of the Indo-Pacific in today's emerging, changing world that we in Australia are a key part of. And that goes to economic security, supply chain security, and the importance to underpin the economies of both our countries. And in that context, I thank everybody, the panelists that have joined the session today, to underscore the importance of the relationship between Australia and the United States. We have Jeffrey Wilson, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson from the Perth USAsia Centre in Perth, who will moderate the session today. Jeffrey has a pretty distinguished career. At the Sydney University, he was recognised with the Sydney Medal for his research work. He's the Vice Chancellor's Excellence in Research Award at Murdoch in 2015. He's a PhD in International Relations from ANU, was the author of a book, Critical Minerals, which was part of a forum in Perth in 2019 in the Zone Conference. That research work and that publication of Jeffrey Wilson on behalf of the Perth USAsia Centre set the base for a debate in Australia that subsequently was a debate in the United States in November 2019, focusing on the importance of this area and bringing parties together and getting relevance and understanding and policy settings in place that chart a good signpost for the future. Jeffrey, thank you for agreeing to moderate. Can I hand over to you now to introduce our individual panelists? And to the panelists again, thank you for your participation in this American Australian Association Zoom forum. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, John, for the kind words, and also to the very esteemed audience that we have on the call either this morning or this evening, depending on where you are. Now, for this audience, I think the topic of critical minerals almost barely needs an introduction, given who we have in the virtual room with us today. But there are some features of this discussion that make it really fascinating. As Western Australian Governor and former Australian Ambassador to the US, Kim Beazley, likes to say, these are the vitamins of industry. Whether they go into technologies, electric vehicles, clean energy technology, or the defence sector, critical minerals are absolutely essential for everything that we consider the conventional life of the 21st century. But current global supply chains are not fit for purpose. They suffer from sustainability issues around environmental and social issues in a lot of the countries they're produced, and also increasingly some security issues regarding choke points, monopolies, and the geopolitical implications of those. It's widely recognised that something needs to be done to secure these industries for the viability of a 21st century technology ecosystem. But this has been a problem that has been widely admired, but for a long time, very hard to solve. The critical minerals challenge has been known for years, but the complex and opaque nature of markets and global supply chains has posed a real barrier to large-scale private sector investment in the industry. The issue is not the availability of the minerals or the geology necessarily itself, but often the technology package. How to establish a value chain that goes from mine to magnet or from mine to battery, that brings different producers, bringing different asset sets across a lot of different countries at the up, middle and downstream ends all at once. The success of Lynas Corp in Australia in rare earths shows that this definitely can be done, but clearly more is needed to deal with the kind of demand increase that we're going to see from technology ecosystem in the next 10 years. Fortunately, it looks like this is now happening. In June this year, the Biden administration published its 100-day supply chain review, looking at 4 sectors that the administration identified as key for the future of the US tech ecosystem. And of those 4 sectors, critical minerals featured twice, both as a standalone item with a focus on rare earths, but also with a focus on large-scale batteries. But the other 2 sectors in that were pharmaceuticals at a time of the global crisis and semiconductors at a time of the global crisis. Really shows that the US government is viewing these critical minerals issues as absolutely essential to their industrial policy, their economic policy, and their technology future as well. This is a level of priority in government action those of us in the industry and working alongside it haven't seen in a decade. And indeed, we see a big opportunity in the Australia-US space that could be opened up by this. Both countries bring different elements and different capabilities and skills to the table in the industry. At the government-to-government level, there is extremely deep trust and political ties required to make this work. At the business level, there's a very long history of commercial engagement between the Australian and US business sectors generally, and particularly in the resource and energy sector. And with the AUSMIN, or Australian-US 2+2 ministerial meeting, just a few days away, we actually have just this week an opportunity to really push forward on this and realise some of those opportunities. So what we're hoping to do in our discussion this morning or this evening is to talk about how we can realise these opportunities. The Australian American Association has excellently found us 4 very eminent speakers who are each going to give an overview from their perspective on the industry for a 5-minute discussion before we then open up to an audience Q&A. Just as a matter of logistics, there is a chat function in this if anyone would like to pose a question either to one of the speakers in response to something they raise or identifying an issue that may come up common across the different presentations. Please put it in the chat function. I'll be moderating these and we'll be able to put them in the second half of the discussion. But with that, I'll open up the discussion and start now. Our first presenter is Allison Britt, who is the Director of Mineral Resource Promotion at Geoscience Australia, the Australian National Geological and Geoscience Survey. Will give us some perspectives on this from an Australian government perspective. Over to you, Allison. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, and thank you to the AAA and the Perth USAsia Centre for inviting me to join you today for this discussion on the US-Australia Critical Minerals Partnership. Now, as a geologist and technical advisor to the Australian Government on mineral resources matters, my perspective is one that's at the interface of science and policy, the interface of the possible and the desirable. And what the Australian Government desires, and what I think is also possible, is a growing and robust critical minerals industry in Australia that supports the prosperity and security of our own nation and that of our partner countries, such as the USA. We also want our growing critical minerals sector to thrive under the highest environmental, social and governance standards, so those we engage with can have absolutely complete confidence in Australian critical mineral products. At Geoscience Australia, we're involved in a range of activities to support the Critical Minerals Facilitation Office, which is the Australian Government's central coordination point to help grow our critical minerals sector. We work under the framework of Australia's Critical Minerals Strategy, and one action under the strategy is to attract investment into the sector to kickstart or accelerate critical minerals projects. And through the vehicle of Australian Minerals, Geoscience Australia helps bring the nation's geological surveys together. And we work with Austrade and the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources to promote Australian mineral opportunities to international investors, provide expert advice and information about the support available from Australia's state, territory and federal governments. Now, on this front, Geoscience Australia also uses its expertise in critical minerals to provide technical advice to the federal government's Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility and the Major Projects Facilitation Agency. Both of these groups are helping to get a range of exciting critical minerals project proposals off the ground with government assistance. But Geoscience Australia's largest expenditure of effort is leading the Exploring for the Future program. Now, the Australian government has invested in the extension and expansion of this very successful program to the tune of $225 million over 8 years. It's scheduled to run to 2024. The program seeks to drive investment in the resources and agricultural sectors by providing pre-competitive data about potential mineral, energy and groundwater resources. It's our largest ever program for this kind of pre-competitive geoscience data acquisition. And the second phase of the activity has the lens of critical minerals cast over many of the individual projects. One of the most exciting projects is our ambition to determine the critical minerals potential in our mine waste. As a leading global mineral supplier, Australia has hundreds of active and historic mines and processing operations, all with associated tailings dams and rock dumps. And these potentially contain significant amounts of untapped resources of critical minerals that with some integrated modelling could support both extraction and modern management of the reprocessed mine waste. Now, to understand more about our potential for critical minerals at tailings, we need to understand more about the linkages within ore bodies between minor and major metals. And this is one of the areas of research that we're progressing with our international partners at the Geological Surveys of Canada and the United States. This collaboration is called the Critical Minerals Mapping Initiative, and it's part of the joint US-Australia Action Plan on Critical Minerals. From a geoscience perspective, both the US and Australia benefit immensely from joining our complementary geological knowledge. As you all know, it's actually pretty difficult usually to find a world-class mineral deposit. So joining the expertise of both countries helps to advance this cause in both Australia and North America. So already in June this year, the initiative published the world's largest data set of critical minerals in ore. And this data set will help us develop a better understanding of the known critical mineral resources, the potential for new critical mineral byproducts from operating mines, and how we're going to find new deposits, those world-class deposits that we need through potential mapping and quantitative mineral assessments. And finally, I'll finish with the point that critical minerals are important to establishing sovereign capability and capacity in the growing renewable energy sector. The projected quantum of minerals needed by 2040 for wind farms, solar panels, electric vehicles and batteries, it's just staggering. Where's it going to come from? We hope Australia and our partners in North America. Apart from renewable energy, we have aligned national interests in many areas, including defence, advanced manufacturing, telecommunications, R&D. And from an Australian government perspective, we think it's important to see these linkages strengthened through commercial and strategic partnerships that also include value adding along the supply chain. Australia and the US have a long and trusted relationship, and we're ideal partners to support each other's critical minerals needs and each other's government's common objective to diversifying those critical mineral supply chains. That's it from me. So back to you, Jeff, and happy to be part of the discussion later.
That's really excellent. And to pivot from this in this Australian government outlook and perspective to the view from DC, I'm going to introduce Dan McGroarty, who's probably known to many of you on this call, the president of the American Policy Resources Network, and a frequent consultant, commentator, and expert in the critical minerals and rare earth sectors in the United States. Dan's been involved in this industry for probably longer than I've been alive, I suspect. But it's certainly also very kindly, when we held a major conference here in Perth in October 2019, made the very long trip out from DC to come and join us and become a much more of a friend of the Australian sector. So Dan, we'd really love to hear from you, particularly how the game has changed in the US over the last couple of months with the Biden administration and where to from here.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeffrey, thank you very much. And I do remember fondly being able to come out to Perth to be in the zone with all of you guys. So fond memories, and amazingly in life before COVID, when people traveled long distances and actually sat at the same table and things like that. And I want to thank the AAA and the organizations there for putting this together and for reaching out. I'm just happy to be able to be part of the discussion. I have a couple of points, comments, I guess, that I'd like to make, and maybe a caveat to add, and then I look forward to the broader group discussion and the questions that we'll get from the other folks who are listening in today, watching today. Jeffrey, you've already mentioned the 100-day supply chain Biden report, which really marked a very high point. It's very high quality piece of work, as a matter of fact. And it arrived on the 100th day, which in Washington, possibly in Australian government circles as well, very unusual, very gutsy to point to the center field fence and say, I'm going to hit it over. 100-day report, and it arrives on the 100th day is no small feat. It did have the 4 supply chains that you referenced in terms of its focus: pharmaceuticals, and actually I see critical minerals and tech metals exposures everywhere. So they're certainly there, even in the pharmaceutical supply chain. But we'll leave that certainly in the device and the therapeutics on the pharmaceutical side. The common cast of characters, rare earths and permanent magnets and imaging and so on and so forth, even in COVID diagnostics. Sometimes it's the same cast of characters, sometimes it's new, yet another new use for another element on the periodic table. But we'll leave that aside for today. The critical minerals themselves were recognized as one of the 4 groups. Semiconductors were recognized as one of the 4 groups. The EV batteries were recognized. Interestingly, I think for the folks here, magnets, permanent magnets, were not, at least separately, elevated to that level, but they're certainly present quite a lot in the reports, in the report itself. And I pluralize reports because really what the new American administration did was to task out DOD to do one part and DOE to do another part, and Commerce to do another part. So these government entities in the US, with their own parallels in the Australian setting, reported back in, and that was kind of collated, synthesized into a single report, but it has these different joints to it. Certainly the critical mineral space is relevant to us. Without question, the EV battery space is relevant to us. I would say even in the semiconductor space, whether it's gallium arsenide in terms of some of the substrates that are required for semiconductors, and of course the global chip shortage that we're all very much aware of these days, but even exotic elements like hafnium, germanium, there are some other semiconductor related materials there. Everything, all of our stuff, I'm careful if I try to paraphrase George Carlin, since it's a family event here, family friendly event here, but all of our stuff is made out of stuff. He didn't say the word stuff, okay, but all of our stuff is made out of stuff, and it's worth remembering that no matter what these sectors may entice us into thinking, because so much of modern 21st century technology reads as magic to us, right? I would even, just as a kind of a marker, the transition to 5G. 5G is going to be a much more physically dense network than what we've been led to think about with 3G and 4G. The densification, the engineers even talk about it in terms of densification. They made up a word for it because it's a small node network, not just a couple of towers and signals going through the air miles at a time, but thousands of nodes, almost like a firefly effect. And so we really have to continue to think about the material demand that's going to be required of us, and therefore the competition if these materials are in short supply, the geopolitics of that, the implications for technology, for economic development. All of those things are attendant. The caveat that I want to make, I guess, for a conversation and then an observation or two on what's going on in the US now, we're preparing to shovel an awful lot of money at these things. The caveat is that when we're looking at the geopolitics of it, we're very aware of the fact that on the Chinese side, where in many cases there's been an uncomfortable advantage or even dominance in some of these metals and minerals and materials, we should avoid the temptation that we should have some sort of a command economy response on our side in order to compete with that. It is going to be, and it is now and will be, an asymmetrical competition for these metals and minerals. I would say in my caveat that both in the United States and in Australia, in Canada, perhaps a little less so because of some of the government agencies in Korea and Japan, we are operating in a market economy setting. Private sector companies are making the decisions on where to put investment dollars. Private sector companies are driving innovation. Incentives, investment, and innovation, those three I's really need to be left in the hands. I think that is our decisive advantage. On the other hand, I will note, and did when I was over in Perth, this doesn't look pretty up close and personal. There are errors made. Money is misallocated. Companies rise and fall. They succeed and fail. And but that is what drives a lot of the innovation and the advantages that take place in the U.S. economy and the Australian economy. In this issue, it would be wonderful if we can coordinate amongst allies. Certainly close relationship with Australia. We're both NTIB nations from the point of view of the United States. We're both in Five Eyes, for instance. But we, I think, need to make sure that what we're doing on a policy perspective is not damping down the incentives, the freedom to invest, and the freedom to innovate, right? So on that score, I guess I'm looking for policy approaches, and I urge you to watch too, because the United States, is it Bunnings? Did I get that right, Jeffrey? Bunnings is the, okay. In our pre-panel chat, Jeffrey mentioned that it might be time to go to Bunnings for a few new tools. The United States has some policy tools that they're in the back of Bunnings, and there's a lot of dust on them, and they haven't been used in 20 or 30 years. And we have to kind of get them out, figure out which way, which is the pointy end. I'm thinking about things like offtake contracts. I'm thinking about tax credits and other incentives that the United States government could deploy, and therefore, and also will be deploying in such a way that it will have an impact on Australian companies as well, right? And that we do that in the United States in such a way that we don't get in the way of free investment, at least for tax credits and offtakes. You have to make something in order to get a tax credit. You have to offer something at the sale window to deliver on an offtake. You're not picking a winner and loser. You're basically putting out a bid or creating a policy incentive attached to actual production. So I think we have to look for those sorts of things. Not to say that the United States isn't going to spend buckets of money in the next couple of days on these issues, but just in terms of sorting through, I hope we'll put the emphasis on these kinds of approaches, sorry, that don't impede the incentives, the investment, and the innovation that I think is going to carry the day for us. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dan. That's some really useful comments, because one of the things I think, as you said, we're grappling with is getting some new tools out in terms of that intersection between a clearly important policy agenda that's coming up, but ensuring that we can actually deliver that in a way that's going to leverage the private sector, its innovation, its investment, and its ability to take risks and innovate through that. To actually deliver and solve this problem. Governments can't do it alone. And that's a really nice segue if we think about going to the very back of Bunnings and getting some tools out we mightn't have used for 40 or 50 years to actually bring in some industry perspectives to this discussion. And that'll be our next two speakers. But the first will be Tania, Constable, who's the Chief Executive of the Minerals Council of Australia, who has been there for some years now after a long career in government service in Australia. Who, thanks for joining us, Tania, and should be able to provide from an industry-wide perspective on Australia, and indeed that private sector perspective of the companies that are going to be tasked with delivering on this agenda, what the outlook is at the present.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, and hello to everyone. And just to follow on from Dan's comments, I like to use the line, Dan, you either mine it or you eat it. And a lot of the time when you're eating it, it's got minerals in it everywhere. So I'm with you on that one. My thanks to AAA and the Perth Asia, just turned my phone off. Perth USAsia Centre for your kind invitation today. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose lands we're all participating in this virtual meeting today. In Canberra, I'm on Ngunnawal country and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I've got some comments to make in 3 areas. Trends that we're all seeing driving global demand for minerals, critical mineral support for strategic reasons, and Dan, he touched on this in his discussion, and unashamedly, I want to plug Australia as a world-leading mining industry, bearing in mind, I think that there is a wonderful partnership that is emerging and should be built on with the United States on critical minerals that we really did start in 2019, and I was part of a high-level delegation with the former Minister, Senator Matt Canavan, in a visit to the United States, which I think has started to pay dividends for us both as 2 countries that we should be building on. So we in Australia have really built in the mining industry a strong reputation for smart, sophisticated exploration, mining and minerals processing from bulk commodities like iron ore, coal and bauxite to metals like copper and nickel, and increasingly critical minerals. And I don't want to lose sight of some of those commodities, including copper and nickel, that will be so important to build a global future. There's no doubt that world demand for resources will increase in the 21st century. Australia and the United States are really in strong positions for future success by meeting growing global demand for commodities to power growth, energy generation and decarbonisation. Technology-led productivity growth coupled with rising urbanisation rates will increase demand for steel and zinc and copper for housing, factories, city and transport infrastructure. Rising incomes and demand for electricity and appliances will underpin demand for aluminium, while the continued proliferation of electronics and circuits will see increasing demand for rare earth metals and silver. And the technology to drive the accelerating transformation to zero emissions energy will need more uranium, lithium, copper and nickel. And that leads me to critical minerals in society. The critical minerals are driving smaller, faster and more powerful technologies, and Australia is rich with minerals critical to global economic progress. From rare earths to high performance metals, these metals are critical because world advances in computing, energy, manufacturing and transportation are impossible without them. They're also critical because production is geographically concentrated when having more competition and choice is essential to global economic development. And Dan also and Allison have touched on those issues. In Australia, we're the 4th largest producer of rare earth elements. Key mines and projects include the Lynas Rare Earths Mount Weld mine in Western Australia, producing around 5,000 tonnes of neodymium per year. Iluka Resources Eneabba Mineral Sands Mine, which is a great news story, and our colleague Tom Leary, of course, will address that issue today. The Northern Minerals Browns Range project, which is a test facility researching ways to extract rare earths from the minerals in time, and Arafura's Nolan's project near Alice Springs, which is also targeting production of neodymium. There are, of course, a number of other projects in Australia that I could touch on, but won't because of time today, and we can talk about those if you wish later on. I'm sure Allison has plenty of comments to make from a geoscience perspective. But there are some major challenges in new mines in Australia and overseas. We've already talked about non-transparent markets. market power of existing suppliers, market imbalances, and environmental challenges are all, I think, impediments that I know that the Australian government and the United States government have been seeking to address for quite some time. It's these factors that have driven successive Australian governments since 2010 to identify and prepare critical minerals strategies to mitigate associated risks, albeit in a stop-start manner until recently. The Australian Government's Critical Minerals Facilitation Office is the government's central coordination point to help grow critical minerals sector and position Australia globally. We in industry would like to see more done by the Critical Minerals Facilitation Office to support business in an outward-facing way, particularly with export industries around the world. I know that there is now a focus on the ASEAN countries, and I think that's an important area for business to utilise the services that are in the Australian government to assist in that regard. In early 2021, under a 1.2 billion modern manufacturing strategy, and again, I was part of a group that looked at the development of roadmaps for a number of key areas. I participated in the industry with other people in industry on the Resources, Technology and Critical Minerals Processing Roadmap. It's one of the major priorities, and it's aimed at capturing significant additional value downstream from mining and to underpin a range of advanced manufacturing priorities. So these initiatives have been designed to encompass key strategic partnerships with like-minded countries like Japan, Canada, the UK, the European Union as a whole, and of course the United States. The shift to electric vehicles and rising energy demand in highly populated emerging economies is expected to drive growth in demand for minerals and world electricity demand. A worldwide shift to electric vehicles will require enormous increases in critical commodities like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. Sustainably sourcing the minerals to support this shift will be a significant challenge and require large investment in new mines. And this is just to support electric vehicle production. Larger quantities of these minerals will be needed to manufacture grid-scale batteries, wind turbines, and consumer electronics. The nation has pioneered new advances in extractive technologies, processing ores into metals, and is ideally placed to lead the growth, diversity, and new applications of critical minerals globally in partnership with the United States. Australia does so with a commitment to sustainability, community engagement, rehabilitation, and decarbonisation of our industries. So it means Australia is well placed as a supplier of minerals to partner again with the United States in pre-competitive geoscience, exploration, mining, minerals processing, and technology development. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, Jeff. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tania. And to round out the panel part of the discussion and also the industry perspective, I'd like to introduce to everyone who hasn't made the acquaintance previously, Tom O'Leary, the CEO of Iluka Resources. Tania just mentioned Iluka. It will be a company known to many of you that is a very much an emerging player coming into the Australian scene and on rare earths, and brings a unique perspective and a different kind of thing to this from what some of existing things would be seen. So Tom, to finish our panel discussion, before we go into questions, please join us.
Thanks, Jeff. And can I add my thanks to the association for the opportunity this morning as well. Iluka is an international mineral sands company with 70 years industry experience, and we operate mining and mineral processing facilities in Australia and also in Sierra Leone. And we've historically operated in the US as well, in Virginia, Florida, and Georgia, and we've still got a presence there. Iluka is a leading global producer of zircon and high-grade titanium dioxide products, rutile and synthetic rutile. We've also got an emerging position in rare earth elements. This is a logical diversification for Iluka, with the mineral sands monazite and xenotime containing the valuable permanent magnet rare earth metals neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. These rare earths are the building blocks of an electrified, low-carbon global economy, which in turn enables a reduction of the world's reliance on fossil fuels. They're essential for the production of permanent magnets used in electric motors to power electric vehicles and wind turbines, along with many other high-value applications. They're also a focus for many governments, as we've heard, eager to establish diversified and secure supply chains for critical minerals. The foundation of our rare earth business is the Eneabba operation in Western Australia, which is the highest grade rare earths operation globally. The Eneabba deposit is actually a man-made deposit in the sense that it was built as a strategic stockpile of monazite and xenotime over several decades. And these rare earth bearing minerals have been produced at Eneabba and other Iluka operations as byproducts of our mineral sands processing activities. And since the early 90s, we've been stockpiling them in a mining void at Eneabba on the basis that they would one day be valuable. Needless to say, that day has arrived. Because the material is stockpiled, Eneabba is unique in that it doesn't require the typical mining infrastructure associated with other rare earth developments. And this has enabled the rare earth stockpile there to be brought to market quickly and sustainably. And in line with that advantage, we've taken an incremental approach to Eneabba's development. Phase 1 commenced operations last year and involves the production of a mixed concentrate containing 20% monazite. Phase 2 is currently under construction and scheduled for commissioning in the middle of next year. It'll produce a dedicated 90% monazite concentrate, and that's significant for a couple of reasons. First, it's a much higher value product commercially. And second, because it's then a direct feed for a downstream rare earths refinery, which takes us to phase 3. Phase 3 is currently the subject of an expedited feasibility study, and it involves the establishment of a fully integrated rare earths refinery at Eneabba, producing segregated rare earth oxides of the type I mentioned, the permanent magnet rare earth elements. If it existed today, it'd be the only fully integrated operational refinery in the Western world. Phase 3, therefore, represents an order of magnitude evolution in the rare earth supply chain. The feasibility study for phase 3 is scheduled for completion in late 21, with a final investment decision on the refinery anticipated in early 22. And just to emphasise that impact on the supply chain, Eneabba phase 3 is not about producing a concentrate or a carbonate that can only go to China for further refining into rare earth oxides. This is a fully integrated refinery to produce the key magnet metal rare earth oxides. So Iluka's development of phase 3 at Eneabba has been the subject of considerable external interest, not least because of its strong alignment with the policy objectives of governments regarding electrification on the one hand and supply chain security on the other. Iluka is working closely with the Australian government on risk-sharing arrangements for phase 3. Back in May, we received a letter of support from the Australian government, which sets out the type of risk-sharing arrangements we're working on, and that letter's available on our website. Importantly, the Eneabba refinery will have the capability to process not only rare earths sourced from within Iluka's portfolio, but concentrates supplied by third parties as well. And this would see Eneabba in Australia become a key global hub for the secure production of refined rare earths, with the mineral value addition all the way through to rare earth oxides refined, undertaken domestically. In the context of cooperation between Australia and the US on critical minerals, the development of the Eneabba refinery, I think, will be a very important step. Equally important, though, is the building out of the midstream of the supply chain in the US, in particular, establishing an industrial scale manufacturing capability for permanent magnets. This is something we're eager to see occur, and we've been encouraged by some recent US policy and commercial initiatives in this area. With that, Jeff, I'll hand back to you.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that introduction, Tom. And thanks to all our speakers. We now move into an opportunity for a managed panel discussion. I have some questions I'd like to ask our speakers here, but also please feel free for those in the audience to avail yourself of the chat box, which you should be able to find down at the bottom. If you have any questions, put them in there and I'll be able to organise these in a way that we can put to our guests, and we have some coming in already. But just before we get into that, there is one burning question I have, which kind of comes out of the narrative that Tom's just presented us around Iluka and some of the feasibility study that would be taking into a refinery. And this comes to this question around critical minerals of the midstream in the value chain. We often see, particularly if you look at batteries as an example, that when you look at the upstream bit, lithium mining, there's a lot of diversity and security. And when you look at the very downstream end, making battery packs and installing them, there's a lot there as well. It's when you look at that midstream, the link between the rock and the magnet, that often some of the strategic liabilities, particularly choke points, often not always being a Chinese choke point, really appears. So what I'd be interested in is getting some panelist views regarding how that can be managed, because this will be a large challenge for Australia and the US. We'll be occupying different positions, and it actually requires a coordinated effort to stand up commercial projects in two separate countries that are in a way soft vertically integrated, or at least at a minimum aligned to their ability to connect across that value chain. Certainly be interested in your perspectives on that, Tom. Also to the rest of the panelists, particularly Dan as well, if you could give us a US view on what that looks like as well. Up to Tom.
Sure, Jeff. Look, as I touched on, I think building out the midstream of the rare earth supply chain, that's the production of permanent magnets, is equally as important as what I've talked about in terms of establishing a production facility for rare earth oxides. Our building of a rare earth production facility is an example of an initial tangible, I think, order of magnitude step that Iluka, supported by the Australian government, could take in relation to secure, diversified supply chains. Beyond this, I have to say, we're also examining the potential to undertake metallisation, which is the very next step in the value chain towards permanent magnets. But the establishment of, as I say, industrial scale manufacturing capability for permanent magnets is absolutely a key imperative. And this is something we're especially keen to see occur in the US. I mentioned that we've been encouraged by some recent policy and commercial initiatives. People have mentioned the Biden's 100-day review, but in particular, I'd note the introduction of the Rare Earth Magnet Manufacturing Tax Credit Act and its admission to the US House. Now, if adopted, it'd provide tax credits for the production of permanent magnets produced in the US based on, using rare earth oxides produced in the US, and that's really welcome. But having said that, I think the legislative initiative would be better still and more integrated if its incentives applied to rare earths produced in the US and Australia equally. I think this would enhance Australia-US cooperation on critical minerals substantively in the near term. And I think there's actually a precedent for that to occur, in that measures adopted under the US Defence Production Act treat Australian companies as American for the purposes of defence acquisition programs. So extending that concept, if you like, to critical minerals is logical. And I think it would also integrate our approach and promote development of integrated supply chains more generally.
That's great. Dan, from a US perspective, could you make some comments on that, particularly the Defence Production Act aspect of that as well, which I think might prove critical?
We had a question that came in from Jonathan Block through the chat on that score. Jonathan references the DPA, the Defence Production Act, which has been around. This is one of those dusty pieces of legislation that's been around since the Korean War. And has been on the books. The DPA in the United States requires a presidential determination. We have pretty fractured politics in the United States at the present. The House, the Senate, the administration, the White House. So getting new legislation through is a difficult thing, to say the least. The merits of the DPA is that it is a law on the books. It's long established, and it requires a presidential determination that something is in an emergency status, a national emergency status. It could be a metal, it could be a mineral, it could be a material, it could be a manufacturing capability, it could be all of them. And the United States in 2019, during the Trump presidency, a presidential determination was issued in regard to the rare earths, but only the rare earths. And that actually was a 5-jointed determination, which covered the light and heavy rare earths all the way through magnet production. And in fact, NdFeB permanent magnets, but also SMCO, samarium cobalt permanent magnets. So it's a pretty nicely, broadly drawn determination. From that should follow in the United States, programs and policies from the defense side that attack that problem, that work to solve that problem once the emergency has been identified. And the emergency should stay in place until it's solved, right? It has, and it in all of the travails that we've had in the United States, that has survived the Trump administration into the Biden administration. The Biden administration, which eliminated a number of Trump executive orders, many of them, actually left in place a couple of them when they dealt with critical minerals, right? So there has been a certain amount of continuity underneath all of that. Jonathan asked the question about DPA. This is what I had in mind about the tools that the United States hasn't gone to the back of the store and pulled out, because the DPA does have they don't call it offtakes, but future commitments to purchase, which is essentially an offtake in the mining sector, and other tools that have not been used for decades in the United States. So there is the ability to use those tools for the first, again, and in the defense context in the United States, Australia is recognized as an NTIB nation, not just an ally, but in that even tighter group of NTIB nations. And then secondly, I would say, and this I guess to Jonathan's point, I'm kind of surprised that of the vast critical minerals list in the United States and the parallels it has in Australia, that the determination of the DPA has only been extended to the rare earths. For instance, EV battery materials are very, very important, but they're actually broader category of lithium ion on the defense side as well. Graphite, cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese. The US doesn't even recognize nickel as a critical mineral. So I would like to see the US, and possibly through consultations with the Australian government, look at whether or not that DPA designation shouldn't be extended to broader groups of metals and minerals. I think that's the next place to go.
Thanks very much, Dan. The next question I'd like to throw to Tania, which is, when we're having this discussion about what some of the tools we might have in the back of the shed are that could be activated here on the government side, obviously from an industry perspective, there are different ways that this can work that's going to be able to be done in effective that enables companies to take advantage of these opportunities, while, as we've commented earlier, but recognizing we are market-based economies, and these are things that the industries are going to deliver. This won't be delivered by a government, government works department. So, and in picking up on some of the comments you made in your opening presentation, what would be some of the, good landing points that we could try and find to navigate that position in terms of policy supports that are going to be able to encourage these kind of activities in Australia?
Thanks for that, Jeff. Just before we do, I just wanted to just do a bit of a shout out to the Australian Strategic Minerals Group that I know are on this call. They have been, they're producers from mine to magnets. They've got a project in New South Wales which is targeting production of around 1,200 tonnes of neodymium, as well as some other metals too. So big shout out to them. Within the modern manufacturing strategy, when we were exploring, well, what could we do around critical minerals, particularly the downstream processing? As has already been mentioned, there are incentives that are in the system, both in the United States and in Australia, that have been used well to bring industry forward. We've talked about tax credits. We've talked about perhaps loan schemes, providing some incentives around collaboration. I think that the government was really drawn to how you might collaborate in that downstream processing area to bring together, again, some like-minded nations that have an interest in the downstream processing that might act in a joint venture, as well as the Australian industry, whether it is in that downstream processing area or producers actually wanting to go further downstream. In saying that, it's not an area where you can just build a downstream processing facility in every state or numerous amounts of them in every state. We have to be realistic about what is appropriate, and others that might be in the industry need to join as third parties through tolling arrangements. So I think they're the sorts of things that that are useful, certainly to industry to progress further downstream. We do need to get aggressive at a global level. We are not the only countries that are in this space. So unless there is some industry support, not least of all, also at the foreign investment review stage that encourages investment into critical minerals. And I think that there are some major constraints there that we've pointed out to the Australian government. We don't see that this is a space that should be constrained in terms of investment. It's that sort of collaboration that I think will make a difference to the critical minerals area. One more area that I think is really essential. We're very expensive to produce in Australia. So anything that also offers opportunity around reduction of energy costs associated with production is very much, I think, appreciated across the whole industry, because it's a very expensive set of inputs that are required to produce in Australia. Thanks, Jeff.
Excellent. Thanks, Tania. Allison, if I could go back to you, part of the discussion we've been having here is around the ability for governments both in Australia and the US to do things to actually change the equation for private sector players in the industry. But one of the unique things about these industries is they are global value chains. And so some of that policy agenda doesn't just live with Australia or the US doing things, but also, as Dan said in his comments, actually perhaps doing some of that stuff together in a coordinated way to line up those different stages of the value chain. Look, as many of you be aware, Australia and the United States have had an MOU in critical minerals since 2019. And Geoscience Australia has been on the forefront of leading that G2G engagement with your counterparts in USGS. Could you give me a perspective on some of the things that the ways that we can align some of those activities between the two countries to unlock the joint opportunity rather than the individual one?
Okay, lots to unpack there, Jeff. Thanks for that. Yeah, you're quite right. Geoscience Australia has had an MOU with the United States Geological Survey. It actually goes back far further than in recent years. It's something we've been doing for several decades, actually. And the critical minerals imperative has really enabled us to sort of recharge that and bring it to the fore. And what we find, the perspective we're coming from as the two geological surveys is, I'm sorry about this. So what we find is that the two nations have the most extraordinary geological talent, and to bring that together, we just see real opportunities for not only identifying new ways of finding critical minerals, but also identifying opportunities that we're currently missing. So this, I mentioned in my opening spiel that we've got this new data set out called the critical minerals in ores. And what that enables us to do is to understand those linkages between major metals and minor metals, and using that, identify where we may be missing byproduct opportunities in current operations, including processing, including mineral processing, to taking that a little bit downstream from just digging it up. So so we can use that as a model then, that successful model of the upstream, to take that down further into the downstream. And Yeah, this is something where we're really leading the way in the sense that it's a tangible outcome of our government-to-government work. Thanks, Jeff.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks, Alison. Now we're coming back to the end. I'd like to go around the group and just have before we finish the session, so everybody can get on with the rest of their days or finish their days for some in the US. Just one quick robin round, everyone, with one last insight. And the thing that I often find is useful to ask this question is, what are the costs of inaction? I think everyone in this room today really understands the importance, the imperative, where these things go, and the opportunity that's there. But it's often useful to sharpen our attention and actually think, well, what if we don't seize this opportunity? What's the cost of inaction, and where, therefore, are we trying to be in terms of creating more security and resilience in this global important industry? If I could probably work in reverse order, and just a very quick, 30-second grab from everyone. Where are we trying to be in 5 years' time, and what would be the cost if we don't seize this opportunity now? And I'll start with Tom and work back to Allison. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jeff. I guess what I'd say is that there's been a lot of talk about the electrification of the global economy and the reduction of our reliance on fossil fuels. And what I think is that there's a growing realization that the key question that's got to be answered from a rare earths perspective is, can we actually do this of our own volition? Or can we only do it if we're permitted access to these essential rare earth materials by the controllers of existing concentrated supply chains? I think what the Australian government is doing, and I've touched on it briefly in my opening remarks, is in engaging with us on risk sharing, it's taking an essential step in facilitating the diversification of the supply chain for these critical minerals. And it's also enabling the achievement of our and other like-minded countries' ambitious targets around the electrification of the global economy and the reduction in reliance on fossil fuels. Thanks, Jeff.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. To Tania.
Hi, Jeff. I'll take the opposite view, not from Tom, the opposite view of the cost of inaction, to the fact, we are acting. I think that there are every country around the world that has I think been at the end of trade sanctions with China over the last few years, and Australia is one of them, is focused on alternative supplies around the world, because Tom just talked about electrification and the opportunities at that global level. I've talked about it at the beginning of my discussion about what's happening around demand. I think there's a real opportunity now for governments to be investing with a business around the world. The United States and Australia have an opportunity if we move faster. And I think that there has been a lot of caution between governments at the moment. And I believe that we are a little bit slow in the way that we are still moving. We are moving, everyone is focused on it, but I think it's actually getting down to, well, what do the partnerships look like? How do we actually move forward some of these, the new mines partnering up with the downstream processing or further into the manufacturing area to create very reliable and sustainable supply chains. That's the opportunity we have right now, and that we should be acting on. And the people that are on these on this session today really should be chasing the opportunities and saying to government, we want these partnerships right now for us to actually get ahead of the rest of the world.
Great, thanks. Dan.
Great question, Jeffrey. I'm thinking about whether I want to use 30 seconds to be the voice of doom or the happy warrior. I think I'm going to choose to be the happy warrior. I'm going to be
happy warrior.
Yeah, it suits me better anyway. But with Tania, we are acting at long last. I think we're acting, or we'll have some sloppy actions. We'll have some regrettable actions, but we could hit the mark and have some actions that actually move us in a positive direction. I would say the 21st century, 5 years from now, we'll be a quarter way into it, more than a quarter way into it. The advantages of incumbency are very hard to undo. We're inventing not just new companies, we're inventing new industries. Think of all the technologies we use now and take for granted that didn't exist 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 5 years ago, right? The advantages of incumbency are very, very strong. And we have to see those forming around us right now. And we have to see whether we can coordinate policy in a way that leverages the advantages of the private market to grab that incumbency, to take advantage of it, make it work for Australia, make it work for the United States, because we're going to live with it for decades to come. I guess I was kind of a little bit of the voice of doom there. Sorry about that, but we can do it.
Thanks, Dan. That sounded happy warrior to me. And to finish this off, thanks so much, Allison. Your final thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with everybody's thoughts so far, because we know that the enormous demand for critical minerals associated with the global energy transition, along with many of the US, European commitments to decarbonise by 2050, and the consumer push for high ESG standards and traceabilities. This all has the potential to improve critical minerals security just through the sheer increase in demand for critical minerals that's projected over the next 40 years. I think it's got the chance that it will force companies and countries to take action to diversify its critical mineral supply chain. But the danger is that there's a possibility that the supply chains become further skewed towards those countries already able to ramp up discovery, production and processing the fastest. And on this point, we'll note China, for example, its record of rapid industrialisation is reflected in its current dominant position as a mineral processor for most of the critical minerals, regardless of its own resources, endowment and mining production. So I agree with Tania and with Dan. We are doing things. We're going to make mistakes, but we've got to keep on trying to do these things, because it is a whole new world out there and there's just so much possibility. Thanks.
Look, thanks to all the panelists and everyone in the esteemed audience for joining us today. But I look forward to, we'll recall John Olsen to give our vote of thanks at the end of the session.
The panelists, thank you for your participation. The debate today has really underscored the importance of this issue and the importance of cooperation, collaboration, innovation to secure and maximise the economic future of both of our nations. And if you want to look at it in a consumer context, the fact that Toyota have reduced their motor vehicle production by 40%, you've got motor vehicle manufacturers in the United States following suit and around the world because of supply chain uncertainty and not being able to build those supply chains in. That's how it reaches out to everyday consumers in the marketplace to get to understand the importance of this issue. The American Australian Association for 7 decades has worked on collaboration and the alliance between Australia and the United States. And the debate today has underscored the importance of that continuing into the future and has greater relevance given the uncertainty and the heightened risk profile in Indo-Pacific region through economic coercion and debt diplomacy within our region. Issues such as this underscore the importance of the future of both our nations. So Jeffrey, in moderating an excellent session, and to the panelists, thank you. On behalf of the American Australia Association, your involvement on such a critical issue has been appreciated and is important. And to the staff of AAA, Debbie and her team, thank you for your administration work underpinning this session. Thank you all. And to all those that have joined us, we trust that you have enjoyed this session. Bye for now.